With an advent of genetic engineering, the global deaf community is facing an existential crisis. It begs the question for the world: are deaf people and sign languages worth preserving? First, having deaf people in the world creates diversity. And what's a better way to study society and the people in it without diversity? If we genetically engineer deaf people out, there will be even less diversity in the world. Then, according to a Deaf Studies research journal, there is evidence that deaf people have some enhanced abilities compared to hearing people because they rely on vision to communicate, not their ears. They have a better developed sense of peripheral vision, a greater ability to form or imagine mental images, and have a better sense of facial or emotional recognition. Communication Service for the Deaf states that these skills can be incredibly helpful for certain professions, such as monitoring security cameras, driving trucks, or flying airplanes. After reading an article from the Gallaudet on Deaf Space, even designing buildings that allow the greatest access to communication would be a fitting job. Each of these jobs require a great deal of attention and visual ability, so who better for the job than deaf people? However, there are many people who feel that deaf people driving vehicles is dangerous. I mean, they can't hear, so how can they drive? But in fact, there are studies to prove that deaf people are better drivers than hearing people. Driving relies heavily on visual skills while ignoring other distractions. Deaf drivers aren't a danger to society, they're a benefit. Furthermore, the deaf community is an extremely close-knit group that prides themselves in being there for each other and fighting for one another. It's amazing how often they are connected to no matter the distance between them. Plus, an event called Deaf Night Out are held for people to socialize. I mean, have you ever heard of a hearing night out? The hearing community is not nearly as close as the deaf community. I mean, sure, we know people and have friends, but not in the same sense that deaf people do. They are important in this world because they show us that nothing should stop anyone from coming together to be a community. However, I have heard people counter this by saying that hearing people are left out of the deaf community because they aren't deaf. But that's not the case. If hearing people spend as much time learning about ASL and deaf culture as they did criticizing and judging the deaf, it would allow them to start to become a part of the community. Lastly, preserving sign language is in itself an important thing because it adds cognitive diversity to the world. Sign languages add a different modality to the world. It's a very kinesthetic way of communicating that is more expressive than spoken languages. Watching someone tell a story in ASL is such a visual experience because you don't have to imagine it yourself. They're already doing it for you. Sign language are an art that should be preserved. However, people argue that learning a second language is too hard and time-consuming. Even so, that does not make it impossible. In fact, there is a universal sign language that can be stood almost anywhere. People would be able to communicate no matter where they went with who was there. In conclusion, although the deaf community is facing an existential crisis, I think it is obvious that deaf people and sign languages should be preserved. They offer so many benefits to the world.